Hello, my name's Nathan Walker. I'm a farm conservation advisor at Norfolk Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group. Today, we're going to be looking at rotational options in stewardship schemes. These are stewardship schemes that are grant funded by DEFRA in the UK and are intended to support the implementation of environmental and countryside actions on land, on farmland in England. As part of those schemes, you often have to declare where you've made or put rotational options. And it's important to make sense of how this works because there are different stewardship schemes. There are older schemes and there are newer schemes, and they work differently. So today in our video, we're going to be considering these different schemes and how to make them work and to understand what you need to do and when you need to do it. So this video is designed for people who have stewardship schemes and need to understand what they need to do with their annual declarations. So let's first of all ask the question, what is rotational options, to make sure we're all understood what we're talking about. These rotational options are management options. They're land management options that are paid by the hectare for management in certain areas of the farm, but which move around the farm with your rotation. So you might do them in different places in your farm every year. Such options in schemes are often things like wild bird mixtures or pollen nectar mixtures. Some of those things often move around the farm, and they can be useful if placed in different places in the farm, and they can move around with the rotations in your farm. And therefore, it's important to understand how to use them best. Which we're not going to be considering the best practice on those today, but what we are going to be thinking about is the rotation. These are the rotational options which you then have to declare to the Rural Payments Agency, to DEFRA, every year. And you have to declare where you've done them, and you have to declare how much of them you have done. It's important to note that the reason for this video really is because in the older schemes and in the newer schemes, the rules for those schemes and what you need to do and when you need to do it vary very slightly between those schemes. So stick with us and we'll help you through those different things. Obviously, the payment that you get for rotational options is determined by what you declare. So if you declare a certain amount of wild bird mixture, for instance, then you will be paid that amount that you declare, and it's important, therefore, to get that right. The other thing I've put here on the screen for you to look at is to understand that the annual declaration and the rotational declaration, or sometimes people call them a claim, an annual claim, they are different things. The first, the annual declaration, is essentially, it is just that. It is every year you will need to declare that you have done what your agreement has asked you to do. It's as simple as that. It is usually just a tick box with a signature. The rotational declaration is different. Not everybody will need to do one, because if you don't have rotational options in your scheme, then you won't need to do one. But the rotational declaration is for those people who do have rotational options in their scheme and need to tell the RPA where they've put them. And so those people who have rotational options will need to declare through the rotational declaration what they've done. Now, I've put them here as different things. In the older schemes, in the ELS and HLS schemes, and in the mid-tier and higher tier schemes, you generally do those two things on the same form or in the same process. But in SFI, they've been separated out, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So I've put them here to make you aware that there are essentially two different things. And it's important to understand those two different things. So let's start by looking at the entry-level stewardship scheme or the higher-level stewardship scheme, or ELS or HLS. There are still some people who have higher-level stewardship schemes around. They've been around for a while now, and as such, because they're an older scheme, they generally work on the basis of a PDF form, which you have to fill in every year, and you have to email that back to the Rural Payments Agency. In an ELS or HLS scheme, there will be a maximum amount that you can claim, and it's the amount that you put on your application originally. It is the amount that is in the agreement. That is the maximum amount that you can claim. So, for instance, if you have 10 hectares of a winter cover crop in an ELS or HLS scheme, you will only be able to claim a maximum of 10 hectares. You will, however, be able to claim less. And so in your rotational a declaration, you will need to say the hectareage that you've done and the fields that you've done it in. You will make that declaration from the middle of February to the 15th of May, and the RPA will tell us when that window opens. The key thing about the ELS and HLS scheme is that the declaration that you make in your rotational options is for declaring the location of those options in the current cropping year. In other words, these are the things that you have put in the current cropping year from the autumn that's just gone through to harvest that's coming up. Assuming that you're making this declaration in May, this would be for the cropping year that started last autumn, and it will finish with the harvest coming up. If we take our winter cover crops as an example, if I was declaring 10 hectares of cover crops, for instance, I would be needing to declare where those cover crops have been in the winter that has just gone. Not in the winter that's coming up. This is for the winter that has just gone. The only exception to that is for overwintered stubbles, which the RPA require you to tell them about where those stubbles are going to be in the winter that's coming. But for every other rotational option, essentially it will be for where the location of those options have been in the current cropping year. Moving on to countryside stewardship, that's mid-tier or higher tier for those people who've still got some of those schemes. This is pretty much the same as an ELS HLS process. There is a maximum amount you can claim in your agreement. You will be paid for what you declare. The declaration is made in the same time frame as the ELS HLS. It's made from mid-February to mid-May. And the declaration is the same in that you make the declaration based on the current cropping year, with the exception of winter stubbles. The only difference really with mid-tier and higher tier is that you will make the declaration inside the online Rural Payments Service portal. And you will do the annual declaration and the rotational declaration together in the Rural Payments Service. If for any reason you have issues going on with land sales or transfers, for instance, then there is a backup PDF version that you can fill in and email to the RPA instead. But essentially the process is the same, and essentially the declaration, as I say, is the same in that it relates to the current cropping year that started with last autumn sowing, and it will finish with the harvest that's coming up, and the location of those rotational options has to be in that 12-month period. When we get to the sustainable farming incentive, this is where it gets a bit different, and this is why we're doing this video. In the sustainable farming incentive, you will make the annual declaration within the last 2 months of your agreement. Now, with SFI schemes, these schemes started on different months in the year. You might have an SFI 2023 scheme that started in April, and you might have an SFI 2024 scheme that starts in May, for instance. That's obviously going to add its complexity to you. But for each of those schemes, your declarations will be made in the last 2 months of the agreement year. So for instance, taking our April start example, your declaration will be made in February or March at the end of the first agreement year. So the first declaration will be made in that period. And the declaration is made up of 2 parts. And this is why it's important to think about these 2 declaration parts. The first is the annual declaration, where you will essentially have to say, yes, I've done everything that was asked of me. And that's the first part. The second is where you will make your rotational declaration. And you will be invited to make those first and second declarations by the RPA in that order. You won't be invited to make a rotational declaration until you have made your annual declaration. The other thing that's important to say is that you will do this in the Rural Payments Service on the back of an email invite. You won't be able to do it until the RPA have given you an invite to do so. The other thing that's important to note is that obviously the amount that you can claim in the SFI scheme is different. In your SFI application, you will have made an application. So using our cover crops as an example, for instance, I might have applied for 10 hectares of winter cover crops. But in my annual declaration, in my rotational declaration, I will be able to claim more than that, or less than that, depending on how my rotations have worked out on my farm. The only thing is that I can only reduce my claim by 50% from what I applied for in that first application. The only exception to this, and it's important to note this, for those of you who've got SFI schemes that have been applied for in 2025, who are in what's called the exceptional category, those people who were invited in by DEFRA to apply for an application that was worth 9,300, those scheme holders will only be able to claim a maximum amount. You won't be able to claim more. You will be able to claim less, but you won't be able to claim more than what you apply for in your application. So that's very much like the old stewardship schemes. So just bear that in mind. Only people who have SFI 2023 and people who have the SFI 2024 schemes will be able to reduce or increase their claim as per your rotation. The key difference with the rotational schemes in SFI is that you are making the declaration for where the options are going to be in the next 12 months. So this doesn't relate to cropping years. This relates to essentially a calendar, 12-month calendar process. So if your agreement starts in April, for instance, started on the 1st of April, and you had 10 hectares of cover crops in your application, when you come to make your first rotational declaration at the end of your first agreement year, you will be making a declaration for where your cover crops are going to be in the next 12 months. So for instance, if I was going to be saying I can only do 8 hectares in the next 12 months, then I should be declaring 8 hectares for the coming winter, the winter that is going to come. Okay, not for what I've put in the last 12 months, but for what I'm going to put in the next 12 months. And that applies to every rotational option. You are putting them in, you are declaring where they're going to be in the next 12 months, essentially in the next agreement year. And therefore, what happens is at the end of the agreement year, you are then declaring that that's what you have in the end done. Now, this is what makes it complicated, and we have people who have already fallen foul of this, making the mistake of wondering what rotational options they are declaring. In essence, that means that your application that you made right at the beginning of year 1 becomes your first rotational declaration. Okay, and therefore the declaration you make at the end of year 1 is essentially the rotational declaration for year 2, and the one you make at the end of year 2 is the rotational declaration you make for year 3. And you will not make a rotational declaration at the end. I've put this in a table in the next slide, hopefully to lay that out a bit easier for you. So as you will see, the rotational declaration that you make for year 1 is essentially your application. So you need to make sure you get your application right, because that is what you are declaring for year 1. Therefore, at the end of year 1, you will declare what you're going to do in year 2, and so on. And then at the end of the agreement year, you will make an annual declaration, which is where you essentially say what you've done, and if you haven't managed to do anything. And so this would be the opportunity, my guess is, if for any reason you declare that you, at the beginning of the year, you're going to do 10 hectares, but you only managed to do 8 in the winter coming, then it would be at the end of the year in your annual declaration, when you say I have or I haven't managed to do everything I should have done, you will need to make an indication there to the RPA to say, actually, I've only managed to do 8 hectares and it's been in these fields. And that's the time to do it. So the process is different, and it's important to understand that. If there's been any further questions that come out of that, then please feel free to contact the NFWAG advisory team on advice@norfolkwag.co.uk or ring our telephone number 01603 814 869, and one of the advisory team will be able to help you through this if you have any questions, further questions about how you implement rotational option declarations at the end of your scheme year. I hope that's been helpful. Thank you for watching.